Come with me as once more we delve into medieval social history. This week, communal sanitation, or lack of. Hey guys, welcome back. Social History Sunday. Right, so, was medieval England a smelly place to live? Following on from the little discussion we had, which involved, which brought in up the subject of dysentery, I thought we'd go a little bit more in depth into the, shall we say, less salubrious side of medieval life. First off, did it stink? Well, no more than modern. Depends where you lived. For instance, there was no such thing as sanitation, sewerage, things like that. When it comes down to hygiene, again, it depended where and how you lived. And what you've got to remember is the medieval people had completely different attitudes towards human and animal waste. We would have found it to be absolutely disgusting, but they lived a different life. So we'll start off with something which is fairly close in terms of proximity. We'll look at the town of Billingham, my hometown. Now the medieval town had the medieval village, had approximately 80 residents actually in the village itself, of which surrounding the village green there were actually 2 farmhouses which led off in different directions. Altogether, the village itself, because of its proximity, was bounded to the north and to the east by farmland and by farmland. There was one cow farm which is believed to have had about 100 head of cattle, which was actually quite a big herd for the time. And all the rest were arable farms, but each of the arable farms, of which I think there were 5, kept animals, and mainly pigs and geese. And each of the farms is thought to have had, if they followed the average sort of makeup of medieval northern farms, they had between 10 and 20 pigs per farm, and possibly as many as 50 geese per farm, with a family unit of between 6 and 10 people. Now, the pigs themselves, if we're talking about waste, about manure, the pigs were a good source of manure which was used on the land, and they produced around about 120 pounds of manure a day, which had to be disposed of somehow, and generally that was spread straight out onto the farmland as and when required. The human waste for the farmers was generally dumped straight into pig to be mixed with all the rest of the waste that was used to feed the pigs. Charming. This is one of the reasons why dysentery was quite common. Once an outbreak started, it spread like wildfire, because pigs, like humans, can catch dysentery, and it affects them in the same way, and they catch it in the same way. So once a pig got dysentery, it would spread, or once a human got dysentery, it would spread. And it was quite devastating once it hit. As for the human waste in the farms was just mixed in with the animal waste. Urine was actually collected. Now in this area, the nearest dye industry was Newcastle, so it wasn't really feasible for the liquid waste to go that far. But what they actually did with it is they stored a certain amount of it and let it mature, as it were, and it turned into something which in northern medieval England was called lant, A-L-A-N-T, lant. And that was basically, they used it for cleaning, believe it or not. Not in the same way we would use an antibacterial spray or something like that. It was mainly for removing grease stains from cooking fires and things like that, from wooden floorboards. It would be used to remove blood stains from when they still slaughtered the animals, which generally happened around this time of the year as well, by the way. November, December is when traditionally the pigs would be slaughtered and taken off to market. And usually each farm, of the 10 to 20 pigs they had, they would keep one boar and the rest would all be sows. And the ones which were born throughout the year, they would be slaughtered and took off to market, which would leave them, generally speaking, with an almost permanent, I can't think of the word, permanent pack of pigs of one male and between 5 and 10 females. That would be your breeding stock, and until they got to a set. But anyway, getting besides the point. So the land would be used for cleaning up bloodstains and things like that, and when the fat was rendered for making soap, that sort of thing, they would clean up all the greasy stains with that. So, because it was high in ammonia, in the village itself, each of the buildings would have its own cesspit, basically a hole dug in the back in the garden, into which waste was thrown. Again, the liquid waste was kept, the solid waste was just thrown into the cesspit. Now that was allowed to rot, much like a modern garden compost heap. And then come the spring, it would all be turned over, mixed up, and then dug into the garden. Because you don't forget, each household of about 6 to 10 people would have basically a garden in which they would grow fruit and veg and things like that for their own personal use. And as well as if they had an excess. Because don't forget, the houses around the village would be the homes for the clergy. The alehouse would be where the brewers lived. You'd have a joiner's, a blacksmith, that sort of thing. So there would be households there which made their living through other means, such as artisans, but they would subsidise their living by growing crops. And the human waste, again, once it had rotted down and composted, would be used as fertiliser. So generally speaking, in the village, life itself, apart from the odd outbreak of dysentery, which would usually come from tainted water, possibly from the well, was quite, by their standards, quite hygienic, quite healthy. By our standards, we probably wouldn't appreciate it. But it wasn't really a problem. Where the problems really started with, in terms of hygiene, public hygiene, is when you start moving into the towns. Now, the nearest larger town to Billingham, where we're talking about, is Stockton-on-Tees. That had about 1,000 residents, and it was mainly artisans, merchants, tradesmen, that sort of thing. And generally speaking, the houses were built so close together that they didn't actually have a garden in the same way as a village would. So the waste tended, the night soil, as it was called, tended to get thrown out of the window. Now, if there's a dyeing industry, a fabric industry close by, again, the urine would be collected. But there wasn't to Stockton, so a small proportion of it would be collected to make land for cleaning, and the rest of it was just thrown out in the street with the rest of it. And it would be an absolutely disgusting, foul-smelling, because not only did you have human waste just thrown into the street, you'd have animal waste as well. And generally, the only way it was got rid of is you had a central gutter in the street, in the cobbles, down which the liquid waste would run, and the houses and the streets were built on a slight incline so that it would all run in one direction, generally towards the river. But then you would actually have people who were called muckrakers and muckers. Now, it's funny, especially down south, mucker is a bit of a nickname. You might say to someone, "How you doing, me old mucker?" And it's a sort of a term of endearment, but it comes from the jobs that people did in medieval towns. And a mucker was basically somebody who literally made a living from collecting muck out of the streets. And they would use it to create fertilizers and other, like land for using to be sold on to the big house and things like that, or to be used in dyeing, which they would actually collect because they could collect quite a lot of it, and they would sell that on if there was a dyeing industry in the area. The rest of the muck was just collected and spread into the fields around the town. So that could actually become quite smelly. There was another title for him was actually the muckraker. Now these days a muckraker is somebody who goes through people's past on the internet and things like that, looking for those juicy little tidbits that they can use for cancel culture and things like that. That's a muckraker these days. But back then, a muckraker was employed by the town to literally rake all the muck up out of the streets and dispose of it. Sometimes in a communal cesspit, sometimes just by spreading it. But they also looked for the juicy little things that had been dropped in the street. For instance, coins that were dropped. Your average person wouldn't want to pick them back up if it had landed in some waste, shall we say. Whereas a muckraker would go through all of this stuff and keep an eye out for those little trinkets like the extra coins, and that would be used to subsidise his income. And apparently it could be quite lucrative. Muckrakers in London could apparently make a couple of shillings a week if they had a big enough area to rake over. And sometimes they would actually, these muckrakers would collect all the muck, because it was quite often used in building materials for making for making daub, which is basically a natural lime-based cement type plaster which is used for building walls, and that was used quite often mixed with human and animal manure, and because when it went off, when it was mixed with straw and lime, it made quite a hard-wearing, solid, almost cement-like material. So that was something else that was utilised. Nothing went to waste if it could possibly be helped. So that's the villages and the towns. We also have the manors and the castles. Now in castles, everybody's heard of the guard robes and the privies and things like that, which were essentially just holes built into the wall with chutes down which waste was, shall we say, jettisoned by the inhabitants. And that just fell onto the ground outside the castle or possibly into the mud. And again, this is where some of the problems came around when the waste leached into the water table, which meant that the well became contaminated or at least became a bit fetid, which is why water was always boiled before it was used. But again, urine would be collected and used for cleaning and for bleaching as well, things like that. But again, as we're getting more and more going up in higher value properties, from the lowly village farm up into the towns where your merchants lived, then up into the manors and the castles where the nobility lived, the stench must have got worse and worse and worse, because the way it was disposed of became more and more casual. As far as the inhabitants of a castle were concerned, out of sight was out of mind. They weren't bothered about the smell. We're assuming it didn't bother them, or it was done in such a way as in like a 30 or 40 metre drop from a castle tower, it was out of mind, and it's like, generally speaking, they didn't smell it that much, so they weren't bothered. But there's a thing you've got to consider. There was no real internal plumbing. So when you got to some of the manor houses, and when we get into some of the royal palaces as well, like Windsor, or what's called Windsor now, places like that, there were no toilet facilities as we would recognise them. There were literally just chamber pots everywhere. And then you had people whose job it was to go around and just collect and empty these chamber pots. Now, this is the interesting thing. We know that during the medieval era, the royal family, the crown, the king or queen or whoever, were constantly on the move. They would go from estate to estate to estate, and generally stay a couple of weeks at one person's estate and then they'd move on to somewhere else. Part of this was because of the smell and the stench and the mess that the royal retinue left behind. So they would stay somewhere until it got that bad they couldn't stand it anymore, and they'd move on somewhere else. Mainly because, for instance, if we look at the retinue of Edward II, Edward III, or even like any of the Henrys, it would, when they weren't away on campaign during the winter, for instance, it might consist of 500 people, 500 followers, and they would move to a manor or a stately home or a castle, and they would stay for quite a few weeks, living off the hospitality of the nobility. But if and when they needed to go, and we're talking like a couple of hundred people, they would just find a chamber pot somewhere, which generally they would just be packed into cupboards or into the bottom of pot stands and things like that, and they would just find a quiet corner, hike up the skirts or pull down the hose and what have you, and they would go in the corner. Not bothered. It was just part and parcel. And then first thing in the morning, somebody would come around, find the chamber pots and take them away and empty them and replace them with a clean one. And the smell must have gotten horrendous, because the stuff was literally just thrown into the midden, the cesspit at the back of the home, the back of the hall, probably near the gardens. But during the day, when after these had been used, if you imagine, on average, a human produces between half a pound and a pound of solid waste a day. And quite often you go at least once a day. But if you've got 200 or 300 people in your home, all relieving themselves at least once a day in a chamber pot somewhere, the smell must have got really bad. And there are quite some apocryphal stories to go with it. Not so much from England, but for instance, the stories of, well, for instance, Marie Antoinette, Louis, whatever. I know this is a little bit later in time. Apparently, there's two stories of Marie Antoinette one being urinated on from a balcony during a ball at a party at somebody's home, and she wasn't bothered. Apparently, it was just part and parcel. Another time, she was walking across a courtyard, and somebody emptied a chamber pot out of the window, and it covered her. And like apparently, she was from waist down. Her skirts were covered in human waste. Wasn't bothered. This is why also in the 16th, 17th centuries, high-heeled shoes started to become really, really popular, because it elevated you above above the waist in the streets as you were walking around. It wasn't so much a fashion thing, it was a practical thing to keep you out of the muck. Ugh, disgusting. The smell must have been horrendous, because it wasn't until the 1800s that people started to come up with ideas for sewerage systems and flushing toilets and things like that. I think the earliest known flushing toilet system was actually for Elizabeth I, and it was installed, I can't remember the name of the guy, it was the only one in the country. It was installed for Elizabeth with a basic flushing system for getting rid of waste. But when you come to the kings, the Privy Councillors, they were actually called that because they were the closest person to royalty. They had the undivided attention of the king for a certain amount of time each day, because basically they were they were the royal arsewipers. The Privy Councillors were generally a high-ranking member of nobility, usually quite close to the king or the queen, and they were employed purely and simply to wipe the backside of the king. and to dispose of any waste, or to start the disposal process. And it was quite a lucrative position. People would fight over getting positions such as Privy Council, because you had the undivided attention of the king for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes at a time. An unrivaled position to be in. Anyways, I don't think we need go on anymore. Like I said, it wasn't until the 1800s that the streets started to be cleaned up. I believe the first working sewage system was actually in Glasgow. I might be wrong about that. But that again wasn't until the 1800s. The sewage system in London didn't start to be created until around about the mid 1800s, at about the same time as they started building the tube systems. Before that, there was rudimentary sewers, but everything was just surfaced sewers, which were just washed and raked and pushed into the river. And that's the biggest. That's why medieval towns grew up around rivers, because it was one of the reasons, so they could get rid of waste. There was always something to be got rid of. Anyway, hope you found that interesting. Well, not interesting, but of interest, and not too boring. Stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, and we'll talk again soon. Tomorrow, we're doing a meet on Monday, and we're going to have a look at a low end, well, not a low end, a budget mead called Harvest Gold. Anyway, so stay safe, keep slinging the sticks. We'll talk again soon. Cheers, guys.